It's 1 o'clock, but we'll give it a couple more seconds to give people time to join. Okay, it looks like the recording has started. Is that correct, Desiree?
Yes.
Okay, we'll go ahead and begin then. Good afternoon. I would like to call to order this meeting of the Assembly Budget and Finance Committee of the Whole. It is Thursday, April 15, 2021. We are noticed from 1 to 2 p.m. I am Suzanne LaFrance, the chair of this committee. The vice chair is Assembly Member Perez Verdia. Ms. Camacho, would you go ahead and call the roll, please?
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Allard?
Here.
Mr. Constant? Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Perez Verdia? Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Littleton? And Ms. Zalatel? You have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Camacho. Thanks to everybody for joining, including members of the administration and the chair of the Budget Advisory Commission. I just want to let anyone on the phone know that the agenda and documents for this meeting are posted on the committee's webpage. If you go to muni.org, click on Assembly. On the left, click on Committees, scroll to Budget and Finance Committee. There's a link to the webpage, and you will find the agenda and also the revenue status report for 2020 year end AIM 56-2021 is there as well. And just a reminder to members to please not put anything in the chat that's substantive aside from just getting in the queue because the chat is not recorded. So if you do put something in there, I'll either read it or ask you to read it. So let's go ahead and start with the agenda. We have 4 standard items under new business: report from the Budget Advisory Commission, and then we'll get an update on the COVID relief funds. We'll move on to the budget update for last year and this year, and then the MOA financial status, where we will review revenues, including the report that I referenced that's saved on the committee's webpage, which was on Tuesday's agenda, the Assembly Information Memorandum 56-2021 that we accepted, and then move on to other business, followed by legislative and budget priorities, and then audience participation. Are there any comments or changes for the agenda before we get going? And
Madam Chair, before you do, Mr. Constant here, and this probably is going to show up under D, just a briefing on the status of the alcohol tax.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. So we will add briefing on the status of the alcohol tax we'll add an item D under D, MOA financial status. Great, thank you. So we'll go ahead then and begin with a report from the Budget Advisory Commission Chair, Elisa Rodriguez.
Hi, thank you. My name is Elisa Rodriguez, Chair of the Budget Advisory Commission, and I think what I have to share with you today will be very similar to what I shared at the, oh, my days are blurring together, forgive me. There was a Friday work session related to ARPA funding, and so most of what I have to say is very familiar to that, so forgive me and feel free to ask questions about any of it. So our general plan of action as the BAC related to ARPA funds is to really try to essentially do a gap analysis. So we're working with some wonderful folks within the Muni to really get an understanding of what is in ARPA, what is very specifically covered and what is not covered, and what flexibility is there within the ARPA Act. Additionally, we want to make sure that we very clearly understand what's being covered by other funding opportunities through other federal, grants and programs, et cetera. And so one of the things that we'd like to make sure that we look at is to what extent can ARPA funds be used to offset, seemingly regular municipal functions, so that we can free up people who are not being paid with federal money to essentially go out and seek out additional federal funds, so that we're really making the most of the vast amount of federal funding that's coming out right now. One of the other things that we wanted to make sure that we shared with the Assembly is kind of the overall feeling that we want to be thoughtful and take our time in terms of figuring out how to best allocate ARPA funding. So recognizing that you all are under a lot of pressure to spend at least some of the funding quickly. And so we'll look into that as well to the best of our ability, make some recommendations, et cetera, on how to spend money immediately, but also to be very thoughtful and take our time about how should we spend the money in the long term, what's really going to get us, for lack of a better phrase, the most bang for our bucks. And to be thoughtful about the dangers of flooding the market, especially as we start to see the state expending some of their funds. We've seen in the past that when we have all this federal money come out, if we just put it out all out on the street really quickly, we end up in a situation where our Alaska-based businesses and consultants and organizations, nonprofits, et cetera, they cannot spend that money that quickly. And so a lot of it then ends up just going right back out of Alaska. And we end up seeing organizations contracting with outside entities and things like that. So to the extent that we can spread the dispersal of the funding out over time, it really does help us to combat that flooding and help us to keep more of that money in Anchorage and in Alaska. Some of the other things that in terms of that rapid spending, we are also trying to look into what are the things that were funded with CARES funding that are oversubscribed, and what are the trends in terms of utilization of programs that were funded through CARES funding, so that we can best understand, well, which of these programs really need to be funded with ARPA funds. We need to continue that funding, and which things do we see as we're looking at the trends, subscription is kind of going down, utilization's going down, and maybe we don't need to continue to fund those programs. We're also taking a look at reskilling, and to what extent is COVID going to kind of permanently change the way that we do business? And along with reskilling is just the understanding that our economy was not doing well before COVID. So the idea that we might use ARPA funds to kind of bounce back, if you will, or go back to where we were before COVID is really kind of not the tactic that we would like to take. We really want to think about how can we use ARPA funds to help hopefully put us in a better place than we were when we went into COVID. And reskilling could be part of that. The other part of that could be investing in trying to tackle those long-term challenges that face Anchorage and that face Alaska, such as, shipping and supply chains and downtown restoration and those bigger economic barriers where, we have in the past maybe said, well, if only we had, X millions of dollars, we really could fix this. And now we do. And so we want to understand, to what extent can we use those funds to tackle those bigger issues. I already mentioned leveraging funds by offsetting municipal functions, maintaining a focus on equity in assistance. So we really wanted to applaud the Assembly in the focus on equitable disbursement and really making sure that those who were most vulnerable or most affected by COVID and by the downturn in the economy overall were the focus of assistance. And so we want to maintain that as we go forward and think about how you might spend and allocate ARPA funds. And then one of our BAC members very rightfully brought up, don't forget to collaborate with tribes. So we often think about trying to make sure that we don't duplicate the services that might be coming out from the state, or duplicate funding of programs that the state might then come out and fund, but also to think about what are those programs and organizations, et cetera, that the tribes are funding, and to collaborate with them to the extent that we are able to in that regard. Another argument, sorry, this is a bit longer than I typically speak. Another argument for the idea of, taking our time with this is one of the things that, kind of within the economic development community that we've all been talking about was tourism, and just how challenging the season is going to be for really everyone, and how, gosh, if there's a priority in terms of funding, it really should be that, right? And I think we were all kind of convinced of it, and then the state comes out with their programs to provide relief to tourism-based businesses. And that was a perfect example of, had we jumped too soon with this kind of, well, we all just know that that's going to be terrible, we would have duplicated services and funding and things like that. So I think with that, I will end. And if anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to respond. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. Let me just note for the record before we go to questions that we were joined by Mr. Weddleton at 1:05 p.m. and we do have Mr. Constant in the queue. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. I was curious about what you suggested that, and you kind of used it in the past tense, not in the future tense, that there were local organizations that ended up having to send money outside.
Yes.
Can you help me understand? I can foresee that, but I have not heard of any of that happening up to now.
Yeah, so I'm trying to recall exactly when it happened. I believe it was in the last, I want to say the Great Recession, where we didn't have nearly as much funding on the streets as we do now, but there was an effort to put funding on the streets. And we had situations where organizations, it really depends on what the funds are, what the requirements of the funding are. But to the extent that, we have to use funding even for reskilling and things like that, if we're using, especially in light of COVID, online-based reskilling programs, we might be subscribing to programs that are run, operated, everything by people who are out of the state. When we think of a lot of consulting services, kind of broadly speaking, as we are trying to, it might be improving, childcare and options for childcare and those sorts of things, and trying to figure out, well, how would we best do this for Alaska? Thread, I'll use Thread as an example, not to speak for them. We might be in a situation where Thread can only do so much. They can only hire people so quickly. They can only take in so much analysis internally. So in that case, if they really need to do a study or something like that, if that's what's being funded, well, then they're going to reach out to perhaps McKinley Capital, formerly McDowell. Well, if McDowell's oversubscribed on all sorts of projects because they are getting funding from all sorts of other organizations, well, then they can't go to McDowell. So then they will likely go down the list of Alaska consultants, all of whom would have lots of money because we want to know how best to do X, and then they would go outside. That's just a handful of kind of rough examples. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you were talking about a ways back, years ago, 10 years ago, not in the current last 2 years. Because I was just trying to sort through who was doing that in the last year or two, CARES Act related, but it wasn't that. So thank you. That clarifies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, I don't see anyone in the chat. Thank you so much, Ms. Rodriguez, for your update and for the work of the commission. I was happy to attend last week's meeting, and it was a great discussion, and I very much appreciate all the points that you and the other commissioners have raised. So thank you. We will go ahead then and move on to item B in our agenda, COVID relief funds. And do we have Mr. Bockenstead or someone from the administration who would like to take us through these 4 points?
Madam Chair, this is Jason Bockenstead. I'm here, and I know some others from the administration are here. I think the question that I would have before going in, I think this is the first time I've actually had the opportunity to attend this meeting in a couple of months. So I guess the first question that I would have is, what type of information are you wanting on A and B in particular, before I kind of go on?
Thank you, Mr. Bockenstead. For A, CARES grant programs, any new information or updates that the administration would like to share with the Assembly would be good. And same with area-wide general fund 101-000 programs. Any new developments with either of those items. I am not aware of any specific Assembly questions concerning those two. I know we do when it comes to little letter D there under the 2021 American Recovery Plan, have a question that was posed by Ms. Kennedy about the impact to the local contribution to ASD. But otherwise, for all four of these items under big letter B, just a general update and any new information or new development would be good. Thanks.
No, thank you for that. And I will say for the CARES grant programs and the area-wide general fund programs, I don't think we actually have any new information. I think all of those funds have been distributed and pushed out, but I will ask either Mr. Schutte or Mr. Slivka if I am mistaken on that, but I believe that you have all of the updated information. There isn't actually any new information on any of those programs.
Through the chair, this is Alex Slivka. Jason is correct. There might be maybe less than $1 million left out of the $156 million that is in the process of being finally expended. And Chris can talk to the 101 programs, but I believe Jason is correct that all that money that you authorized to spend back in February has actually been distributed.
Great, thank you both for that update and confirmation. Then before we move on, do members have any questions? Okay. Do either of you, Mr. Slivka or Mr. Bockenstead, want to speak to any updates with the Emergency Rental Assistance Fund, or just move into the 2021 American Recovery Plan?
I can speak very quickly.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, that the agreement has been signed, and we're going to be, obviously, I think everybody understands that Alaska Housing Finance is actually going to administer it, and so they're going to take our money, put it together with their money, and it's going to be spread out over several months. So the first piece of $16 million of that $35 million, I believe, was sent out yesterday. And that's it.
Thank you.
And I will only add that, funds are beginning to be dispersed by Alaska Housing Finance to those that have gone through the process. And that's just going to be a program that is going to continue to kind of churn and push funds out. And as part of kind of the agreement, we're going to be getting updates from Alaska Housing Finance on kind of the numbers that are being pushed out specifically in the Anchorage area. And as we receive those, we'll be happy to pass those on to the Assembly as well, so that they have kind of that same information on number of individuals that are being supported, number of families. And as I think everyone knows, there was additional information that was required to be collected as part of this emergency rental assistance. And as we get that information as well in terms of demographic breakdowns, we'll be sure to share that and pass that along to you all as well. I just don't think we have gone far enough into the process yet to actually have any of those concrete numbers.
Great, thank you. And we do have Mr. Constant in the queue. Mr. Constant?
I actually hate to admit it, I think I forgot my question. Thank you.
Okay, well, we can come back to you if you think of it, of course. All right, well, thank you both for the updates. Is there anything to add on ARPA? I know we have had a number of meetings on using the funds. And then there is the question concerning the local contribution to ASD that perhaps, I don't know if Mr. Slivka, you could address that.
I would probably defer to Jason, who I think has mentioned more than once that we are waiting for Treasury guidance in terms of how these monies can be expended. I would just let people be aware that under the rescue plan, ASD got their own pot of money in the same way that they got their own pot of CARES money. So, there were significant resources allocated toward education. But again, the specific, I don't have the specific answer to Representative Kennedy's question. I think we are, as Jason has said, still waiting on Treasury guidance.
Yeah, and I'll just add on a couple of things. One, I have not seen any new information to suggest that the dollar amount that we are expected to receive has or will change, which is still set at roughly $101 million spread out over the course of 2 years. We just don't have the final allocation. They have not finalized those numbers yet. So as soon as they do, we will certainly pass that on and begin the process of putting together the resolution to not only accept the funds, but then also appropriate them into the different areas that I think the administration and the Assembly have already been having a lot of conversations about. And then secondly, to I think the point that Mr. Slivka made is we are still waiting on the actual guidance on kind of providing that framework and doing a better job of adding some of the meat to the actual legislation and those allowable uses. I would anticipate that really any day now, I would expect that those will become available. I think one of the things that I have told the Assembly in the past is the statutory requirement within the American Rescue Plan to distribute funds to local governments. The deadline that the no later than date for us to receive the funds is May 10th. So we're less than, today is the 15th. So we're about 3 weeks away from that deadline. So I would anticipate really at any point in time in the next couple of days or a week, we will start getting some of that information. And just to also kind of reiterate what Mr. Slivka said, within the American Rescue Plan, there is a large portion, almost equal to what local governments receive, that is set aside for school districts across the country. I believe the amount included for cities and counties was 130 billion. I believe the funds for elementary and secondary school is $123 billion. So to the extent that there are questions about us helping the school district, I think as I sit right now, I would say we should figure out what they are receiving and what additional plans they have to do with the funds that they will be receiving, instead of using any funds that we get to potentially help the school district.
Thank you, Mr. Bockenstead. And I believe the concern was if we were to allocate funds to the school district, how would that impact our the local limit of what we can contribute to the ASD, if I recall the question correctly. Thank you both for that information and the update. And we have a question from Mr. Constant.
Thank you. Yeah, I remembered. Sorry, forgetful mind, but so it's more of a comment. I am really glad to hear about the partnership with AHFC deepening because of all of the funding being driven to the state and all of the funding coming from the feds, which will likely go to AHFC on the rent and mortgage, or at least the rental side of the program, because what we have available going forward is limited. But if we have a strong partnership with them, then they're more likely to easily access state funding than we could be. So it's a very important partnership to develop and deepen.
Thank you, Mr. Constant.
And if I could, Madam Chair, if I could
Of course.
just briefly respond to that and provide a little bit more color. We totally agree with you. We've been working very closely with them, as well as Cook Inlet Housing, who received some of the tribal funds related to the emergency rental assistance. And also as part of the American Rescue Plan, there was a recapitalization of this fund. And essentially what that meant is that with the initial fund, the state total, obviously the municipality took 36 million of that, but there was $200 million that was given to the state. Within the American Rescue Plan, that number will be $152 million that will go to the state, and we again will receive our prorated portion of that, and the hope would be that we continue the partnership with those funds with this next round as well. So just wanted to let Assemblymember Constant know that.
Thank you, Mr. Bockenstead. Okay, I don't see anyone else in the chat. We will move on then to item C, update on 2020 and 2021 budgets. Is Mr. Wilbur available from OMB?
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Chair. This is Lance Wilbur, Director of Office of Management and Budget. We'll start off with 2020 year end. Our final actual numbers are coming very close. The controller has got very close to the year end. It allows us our actual numbers. I think on the 23rd of March, they had closed what's called the 14th month, which means it's getting very close. But what I'm seeing right now on general government is with the movement of the first responder payroll and the CARES funds in there, the report would, it's going to be a little bit of time to describe it, because what happens there is with those movements of expenses to the grant, it looks like only 82% of the approved budget was actually spent, when in reality it was just a different color of money that was spent. If I take that into account, I think in all of the departments, in all of general government, collectively they will still be underspent. I think it'll be pretty close to about 98% spent for all of the departments. So as those numbers get finalized, I'll have a stronger sense that that is the case for general government. I think all of the departments did very well. Police and fire, I think they're going to be over their budgeted amount, but that overages has to do, I think, with some overtime and some other expenses likely related to their COVID response. So that in turn was covered with the first responder payroll. So the numbers are coming together, but so far I don't see collectively that we overexpended the budget for 2020. And then similarly for the utilities, we're looking at all of those as well. And I'll just say all of the revenues projections for all of the utilities were down in 2020. The exception being the port. They outperformed their budget revenue projection by about 4 to 5%. And when I look at all of the utilities for 2020, it looks like their expenditures were also under. So at the end of the day, their expenditures are going to be less than their revenues. And so I think the utilities did a very good job as well. And again, as the final numbers come in on all of those, we'll be able to report. So the report you will receive will be a quarterly report. But so far, based on what I'm seeing right now, until the books close, looks like 2020 ended well. So at least from the expenditure side on their actuals. So that's what I have to report for you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, on 2020 year-end actuals at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. I don't see any questions at this point. If you would like to continue.
Sure. So the next item on the agenda is C, letter B, monthly budget to actuals. So we're not going to be able to provide you a budget to actuals until 2020 is done, and then we will start with a budget to actuals for January and then February. So working closely with Mr. Slifka's team to prepare those. It's possibly we'll be able to have one in May, but quite frankly, 2020 was a little bit more complicated than normal. So hopefully we'll have it for you at least by June. But we'll work closely with them, given where we are now. So I think that's what I have for you on the 2020 or 2021 budget actuals report.
Great, thank you, Mr. Wilbur. Did you want to add anything on any impacts of COVID-19 on the budget? Any update?
I think I can add a little. I think we've talked about that in the past. You know, we've over the year we've been using the CARES funds that moved into 101 to assist in our budget, and so through 2020 we've been managing the expenses of on COVID-19 on 2020, and obviously we're going to continue to do that as we go into 2021. You know that there's two parts of the COVID impact that are related to our budget. One of them is the CARES and potentially the whatever the eligibility would be for the rescue plan funds. But there's also the expenses that we've incurred for COVID response that are FEMA reimbursable. And as Mr. Slifka's mentioned in the past, and I'll reiterate now, we're doing everything we can to make sure that our reimbursement is timely, because that does affect our bottom line. And so I will talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Tomorrow at 10, we are going to have a work session on the 2021 first quarter budget, proposed first quarter budget revisions. So I will, I'm working to get together that material. I'm anticipating to forward it to Desiree in the morning so she can get it to you in preparation and prior to that work session at 10 tomorrow. And that is all that I have.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. Appreciate the update and the information. I don't see anyone in the chat. Do members have any questions? All right, I don't see anybody, so we will go ahead and move on to item D, MOA financial status. Mr. Slifka.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You had specifically asked for commentary in regard to the AAIM 5621, which was presented and accepted at the meeting on the 13th of April. The high-level commentary would be that this was more or less in line with what we had expected all year long. Our best guess on revenue shortfall relative to the adopted budget for 2020 was about 23 million. It came in right around there. I would point you to paragraph 3 of the AIM, where it describes the need to take a roughly a $5 million deferred revenue adjustment due to the amount of taxes that were received relative to the amount of taxes that were budgeted. I think this is, you can point to two things. You can point to one, the fact that real property tax was due on December 31st, and also that what I think has been talked about a number of times, that there may have been a missed step somewhere along the line where people's property taxes, a notice of lack of payment wasn't sent or possibly was missed, because the number of notices of foreclosure that was published in the paper was substantially higher than it has been historically. I would mention that irregardless of how many notices of foreclosure, I think historically they've been around 2,000, and and this is just off my memory, I think there were 3,000, but historically 98% of those get paid and are satisfied. So but that describes the negative revenue variance that is reported in the AIM of 29.4 million. Lance is going to go into a lot of detail tomorrow on how that impacted the construction of his budget, but needless to say, 2020 was a very challenging year, and as Lance mentioned, the biggest impact is that we spent money to respond to COVID, and FEMA has been slow in reimbursing us. So Lance will talk about this, but at the end of the year, there's a $35 million reduction in fund balance due to money spent but not yet reimbursed by FEMA. We expect to get the vast majority of that money back in 2021, and we are working very closely with the state to make sure that that happens. But that was among the many driving reasons why, for those that asked, that the due dates for property tax this year are going to be the same as they have been historically, because to extend those in any way, shape, or form would have created cash flow challenges that we just didn't need. I will stop there, and if Mr. Moore is available, let me stop there and see if there are questions.
Thank you, Mr. Slivka. Actually, Ms. Kennedy has a question. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Slivka, you may not have this information right now, but maybe for tomorrow you would or could, or anyway, I guess I'd like to know a little bit more just in regard to the eligibility of certain things that we have done for actual FEMA reimbursement. I know we had at least one incident where we thought something was going to be reimbursable and it turned out it wasn't. So can we just get kind of an update on what else we might expect that might have fallen off of the FEMA eligibility list and that we then might be on the hook for otherwise? But I mean, I can wait till tomorrow unless you happen to know anything more about this.
Through the chair, Ms. Kennedy, I will see if there are additional items. I'm only aware of one item, which I think amounts to $300,000 that we believe is not FEMA reimbursable. But I'm not aware of anything else of any significance. I will say that of the 35 million, 10 million relates to earthquake. 3 million of that relates to the rebuilding of Eagle River roads, which cost significantly more than FEMA expected, and we have been diligently pursuing that reimbursement. But I'm not aware of any material amounts, but I will see if there's information that I'm not aware of, and I will gather that and hopefully be able to give it to you tomorrow.
Great, thank you, appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Thank you, Mr. Slivka. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and move on.
So you had asked the question about, well, first and foremost, monthly revenue report. Just as Mr. Wilbur said, we are still working through the close of 2020. So monthly revenue reports for 2021 aren't going to be available probably until May at the earliest. The question had been asked about alcohol, and I believe Mr. Moore is available if he could provide that answer, please.
Okay. Thanks, Alex and Madam Chair. So this is Dan Moore. Alex already covered the sort of year-end information highlights for revenue. The year we're in now, which is 2021, we have a brand new revenue, that's alcohol tax. It started February 1st, and we actually are now past February, and we're able to let the Assembly know how the first month went, and then in terms of revenue, and then we're going to continue to monitor it month by month based on what we think was what we call a mid-range projection. And it does build in some COVID effects. It also builds in the seasonality, so the summer months would actually bring in more alcohol revenue. So anyway, just focusing on February, because that's the very first month, we waited till after the 7-day grace period. That allows 7 extra days for businesses to remit the tax without incurring any penalty. So now that we're beyond that 7-day grace period, which ended in April 7th of this year, the amount of money for the first month is $759,000. And when we compare that to what we had estimated, and this is like our best estimate with no prior history. So it's, it's the best we could do. Our mid-range estimate, it's basically 93% realization of that initial estimate. So I would say we are very close to on track just for the first month with where we thought we might be. We are going to, like I said, continue to track this over time. If you were to take the 11 months of alcohol tax that we have, budgeted for this year, and just say how much percentage-wise would that be per month, if everything were perfectly even across the board every single month, it would be 9% per month. What we collected in February is 7%, and that actually is in line with where we are, both seasonality-wise and also with COVID and various restrictions that are out there. So, anyway, that's where we stand. And dollar-wise, we're within $60,000 of where we thought we would be for the first month.
Great, thank you, Mr. Moore. And just to confirm, that was 759,000.
Correct.
Great. And I see Mr. Constant typing. Mr. Constant, follow up?
Thank you. Just quickly, could we, maybe next month's meeting, take when we have next month's numbers and this month's numbers, recognizing the COVID effect, and look at what we budgeted for use from the alcohol tax, just so we can see a kind of a budget to actual on both sides of the column, what we're spending it on. That way we can stay in tune with revenues and projected programs.
Thank you, Mr. Constant.
Okay. This is Dan Moore. We will continue to provide the information to OMB and to this committee each month so that we do stay on top of it. The expense side, we do share it with OMB, so OMB can combine our numbers with the expense numbers and let you know how things are tracking.
Great, thank you, Mr. Moore. Thank you, Mr. Constant. Any other questions? We still have item C listed, impacts of COVID-19 on revenue. And that's a topic we've covered extensively and consistently. And I don't know if anyone in the administration wants to add anything here, or if members have specific questions concerning this area.
This is Mr. Moore, Dan Moore. I would just share with the Assembly Committee that part of that AIM that the Assembly accepted a couple nights ago included some graphs in the back, and it shows you kind of what the trends are for various major types of revenues. And for year 2020, which was a very big year for COVID, just as a statistic, which I think is informative, both room tax and rental tax were down about 57%, 57% when you compare 2020 to 2019. And so that's the big impact that we experienced in 2020. For 2021, we did, and this is our prior person that worked in Treasury that's now retired, we did get his expertise to provide the best updated projected numbers for 2021 based on the partial recovery that he had seen and what the industry, like for tourism, is projecting. And so I believe it was about a halfway 50% recovery in 2021. So we do expect continual recovery, but the range is quite large. It's within, like I say, for room tax, millions of dollars plus or minus. So until we get the second quarter data for 2021, we're not going to know with as much confidence as to how this year is playing out. So that's all I can share at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, I don't see anybody in the chat. We will go ahead then and move on to E, other business. Anything we need to discuss here? Okay.
One thing,
Mr. Constant, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't know when we're scheduled off the top of my head to meet with the school board. But I think maybe at some point we'll want to have a really fun conversation with the school board because they're going to be all new members except one, likely, depending what happens over the next couple days. And so if that's the case, I would like to suggest a budget-focused meeting early with them, even though they'll all be kind of stressed from the new job and all the pressure. I just want to add that to our conversations with them.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. That's a great point. Anybody else? Alrighty, we will move on to number 4, our standing items, committee legislative and budget priorities. A, legislative priorities. Anything to bring up? I see a hand up, but I cannot tell who that is.
Madam Chair, that's Lance, and it's on
Oh.
item 4B. Oh, I was trying to get to ahead of you.
Oh, well, the floor is yours, Mr. Wilbur.
I just wanted to remind the Assembly members that as it relates to the budget items for 2022, the community councils are actively looking at their survey for capital projects to be submitted to us at the end of May. Thanks to some of you Assembly members who have directed some questions to my office, and we're helping those folks get some responses to them. But if you have questions, and or if your community council members, as you're attending those, have questions on the capital budget survey process, please feel free to direct them to my office, and we'll help them out. And again, they're due on the end of May, which I believe is Memorial Day. And I also know that there are a couple councils that meet in the first week of the month. And if you talk to them and they don't have their surveys done by that and they need an extra week or so to meet as a council to submit them, just let us know and we'll do everything we can to accommodate it. It'd be great if we're not getting them on June 30th. So the sooner the better. Just as a reminder. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. I see that Mr. Peterson is typing. Mr. Peterson, do you have a question or comment? Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I don't type as fast as others. I was just wondering if there's items that were on the ballot this spring that are failing. Is that something that we need to look at putting into the budget for next year? That's a question for Mr. Wilbur. Thank you.
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Peterson. I think the two items that we are looking at, one is the facilities. Obviously, we'll have to figure out a way how to readdress those. And the other one is the APD fleet. That one is going to continue to be a challenge for us on how we get the fleet to a place that's not 62% depreciated. So yeah, we'll be looking at both of them in operating and capital, and it will obviously depend on the next administration on how they want to address it.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Mr. Wilbur.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, for raising that point. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, that brings us to the last portion of our agenda, audience participation. Are there any members? Oh, is that Mr. Haberman?
Yes.
We can hardly hear you, Mr. Haberman.
Can you hear me better now?
You're still a little bit faint.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I'll take off the speakerphone. I'll start my timer. I'd like to take this time to, I attend a lot of meetings, and I provide constructive criticism, but I'd like to take time to compliment in the way the municipality of Anchorage, when they do annually their proposed budget, and when they issue it, when that goes out, there's in-depth meetings by the assembly with the departments on the proposed budget, and then there's public hearings. And you do it in a way for the public to see those documents and to be able to respond. I'm not saying it's perfect, but out in the valley, they are gone to the limitations that the proposed budget that they're doing annually is being presented on the 20th next week, and for the first public hearing on the 7 days later. And a few days before that, I was at the department presentations of the Assembly, and there was no proposed copy of the budget for the public to see or the Assembly to see. So I know your jobs are difficult, it's time consuming and so forth, but you remarkably do a much more better effort to bring that information out to the public and the Assembly so that a discussion can be addressed on the issues there and go forward and finalize the decisions on the budget. And I thank you for all your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haberman. Appreciate the compliment. Okay, are there any other members of the public who would like to participate? I believe it's *6 to unmute. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, please.
That's correct.
Oh, thank you. Okay, we'll give it a couple more seconds here. While we're waiting, I just want to thank Mr. Bockenstead, Mr. Slivka, Mr. Moore, and Mr. Wilbur for being here and for updating us and providing the information, and agree with Mr. Haberman. Appreciate the process and how it moves for the budget. So thank you. And I don't see anyone else, any other members of the public here who want to participate. And do members of the committee or members of the administration have any final comments before I entertain a motion to adjourn? Going once, going twice. Could I get a motion to adjourn, please?
Move to adjourn.
We are adjourned. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day. Take
Thank
care.
you.
You too.